If you've taken an intro psych course, you've no doubt been exposed to terms like positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, or positive punishment and things like that. But those terms are commonly confused and misunderstood. So in this video, we're going to try to really get clear on them. We're going to cover the four main types of contingencies. And I want to be clear that these can be contingencies we set up deliberately, like to train our kids or our pets or our friends or even ourselves. But they can also be contingencies that we create accidentally and without realizing it, sometimes in ways that alter behavior in a counterproductive way. But also these contingencies can simply come from nature, from the way the environment is set up. For example, if I walk full speed face first into a wall, there's a very clear contingency that this behavior will lead to pain. No one had to set up that contingency for me as a trainer. It's simply a contingency of how physics works. But let's start with some examples that are a little more positive. So when some outcome after a behavior makes the organism more likely to repeat the behavior in the future, that's what we're going to call reinforcement. So that outcome where that behavior becomes a higher probability in the future, that's what we mean by reinforcement. So a reinforcer is any consequence that comes after a behavior that leads to an increase in the behavior in the future. Meaning a stimulus like a treat or a pleasant event or something we enjoy, if that comes after the behavior and makes the behavior more probable in the future, we call it a reinforcer and say that reinforcement has occurred. And there are two types of reinforcement. Two ways that a consequence after a behavior can make that behavior more likely. The first is probably the most familiar. It's positive reinforcement. So if you're presenting or adding some stimulus after a behavior and that increases the behavior in the future, makes you more likely to do the behavior next time, we call it positive reinforcement. For example, let's say you always give a Kit Kat to your significant other right after they empty the dishes, and they happen to love Kit Kats, so it makes them more likely to empty the dishes in the future. That would be positive reinforcement. But here's a crucial key. If it backfires and makes them less likely to empty the dishes, like if they get kind of insulted or something like that, then the Kit Kat is not a reinforcer. It's not positive reinforcement if they don't become more likely to do that behavior in the future. So what makes something a reinforcer is simply that it made the behavior more likely next time. We don't actually technically know whether something is a reinforcer until we witness its effect on the behavior in the future. So just because you think someone will like it, just because you think it will serve as a reward, doesn't mean it's going to be a reinforcer. It actually depends on what it really does in the world. Okay, so an example of positive reinforcement might come from teaching your little kid to be polite. The situation or the context would be, let's say, dessert being served after dinner. The behavior that the parent is targeting in their toddler, that they want to change this behavior, might be teaching the toddler to say please, right, to be more polite. So the outcome they're going to set up is when the toddler does this behavior, the stimulus that the toddler gets is dessert. So when the toddler does this behavior, the parent gives the toddler dessert. We have added a nice stimulus as a result of the behavior. And if we do this, set up a contingency like this, especially if it happens consistently over time, the toddler will become more likely to say please when he or she wants food in the future. That would be positive reinforcement. The positive part, based on the color coding here, you can kind of see the positive part is just because a stimulus shows up. A stimulus is added when the toddler does the behavior. And the reinforcement part is because it actually made the behavior more likely in the future. Again, if this backfires and only giving the toddler dessert once it said please, if that doesn't actually make the toddler say please more in the future, then it wouldn't be reinforcement. So it has to actually work to be reinforcement. Now, sometimes removing a bad stimulus after some behavior will actually make the behavior more likely. So we call that negative reinforcement. Negative doesn't mean bad or you've done anything wrong. Negative reinforcement is when removing some stimulus after the behavior leads to an increase in the behavior it followed. So it's still reinforcement because the behavior becomes more likely in the future. The negative part has nothing to do with whether something is good or bad, liked or disliked. It's nothing like that. We're using the term in a very special sense here. The term negative is simply because you're removing something when they do the behavior. If the behavior leads to something going away, it's always negative, regardless of anything else. Okay? So an example of negative reinforcement from my own life might be the situation or context is what you could sort of think of as the discriminative stimulus here. It's my loud alarm buzzer going off in the morning. So that's the setup. That discriminative stimulus sets the occasion for a behavior that I've learned works here. That behavior is Brian hits the snooze button. Now, what happens when I do that behavior? What's the result or the outcome every time I do that behavior? The outcome is the annoying sound goes away, right? So that's a change in the stimulus, a change in my environment. In this case, it's removing a stimulus. So doing the behavior removed, in this case, a bad or annoying stimulus. And as a result of this whole situation, especially if I've gone through this a few times, now Brian is more likely to hit snooze in the future when the alarm goes off. So it's reinforcement by definition because my snooze button pressing behavior has become more likely. And it's negative simply because when I do the behavior, something disappears or gets removed. That's all we mean by negative. Or another example of this might be, let's say, an autistic child who gets super overwhelmed by loud noises. That child might do the behavior of running away to a quiet place. That running away behavior does something as a result. The outcome is it removes the noise stimulus. Every time they do the running away behavior, the noise stimulus is removed. Since it worked, the child's probably more likely to do the same running away behavior next time they're in the same loud situation. So the behavior has been reinforced. It's reinforcement. It's happening more often. And it's negative reinforcement because every time they do the behavior, it's taking away a stimulus. It's taking away the loud noises. So that's the idea of negative reinforcement. So just to really hammer this home, reinforcement always means the behavior increases or became more likely in the future, more probable. The positive or negative part simply refers to whether the thing happening right after the behavior was an addition of a stimulus or a removal of a stimulus. That's all we mean by positive and negative. So then, what's the opposite of reinforcing something? The opposite of making it more likely in the future? Well, let's talk about punishment. When some outcome of a behavior, the thing that happens every time after you do the behavior, if that outcome makes the organism less likely to repeat the behavior in the future, we call that outcome punishment. So a punisher is just any consequence after a behavior that leads to a decrease in the behavior in the future. Like if doing the behavior makes something crappy happen, if doing the behavior makes something I dislike show up, or if doing the behavior takes away something I do like, all of those outcomes could be a punisher, but if and only if they actually make the behavior less probable in the future. And just like with reinforcement, there are two main types of punishment. So positive punishment would be if you're presenting or adding some stimulus every time the behavior occurs. So if the behavior leads to the addition of a new thing showing up in the environment, a new stimulus that actually decreases the behavior in this situation in the future, that's positive punishment. For example, spanking a misbehaving child would be positive punishment. So when they do the misbehavior, that's their behaving, the result, the outcome, the thing they experience is the addition of that painful spank stimulus. That would be positive punishment if it actually works and makes the misbehaving less likely, if it changes the probability of the kid's behavior. Or a cat biting you when you attempt to pet its belly. That could be positive punishment for your behavior if it actually makes you stop trying to pet the cat's belly. So if so, the cat bite has served as a punisher for your belly petting behavior. Separately, yelling no at the cat when it bites you might be your attempt to use positive punishment on the cat's biting behavior. However, that'll only count as positive punishment if that contingency of yelling no actually makes the cat less likely to bite in that situation in the future. If you're yelling at the cat doesn't actually work and it keeps doing the biting behavior, then it's not actually punishment. Even though that might have been your intention, we're not going to count it as punishment. Punishment only counts if you see actual results. So Another example of positive punishment might be like getting a speeding ticket. So the situation or the context, you're driving out on the highway. That's sort of our SD, our discriminative stimulus, right? The behavior would be maybe you're speeding 20 miles per hour over the limit. What is the result? What's the contingency here? When you do that behavior, something happens. Maybe the outcome, the result of your behavior is that a police officer gives you a ticket. They add something crappy to your life. Or maybe they yell at you. And getting pulled over adds to your anxiety, right? That's adding a stimulus you don't like. But basically something bad is added as a result of your behavior, your speeding behavior. What does that lead to? What's the long-term outcome? Well, in the future, maybe you don't speed as much. If you're not speeding as much on the highway, right, then that could be positive punishment. Now, obviously, if it doesn't work, like if you're a billionaire Jeff Bezos and aren't bothered by speeding tickets because that's pocket change, it might not actually change your speeding behavior. And in that case, it's not actually a punishment, regardless of what the officer intended or what the law intended. The behavior has to actually go down for it to count as punishment. And what makes it positive here, you can kind of see by the color coding, what makes it positive is simply that a stimulus is added each time you do the behavior. So don't think of positive as good or pleasant or anything like that. It's positive like addition, like adding something being added when you do the behavior. Finally, sometimes removing a stimulus, like removing something you enjoy and like after the behavior, makes that behavior less likely in the future. So we call that one negative punishment. When removing some stimulus after a behavior leads to a decrease in the behavior it followed. So an example of negative punishment might be what happens if you drive drunk. The situation or context is that you're buzzed and the behavior in question is getting in your car and driving. So drunk driving behavior. Now, what might be the result here? There's a contingency in place. It might be something like, if you drive drunk, then a police officer will take away your license. So they're taking something away, some stimulus that you like, something is removed as a result of your behavior. So the behavior led to the removal of something. So we're going to call it negative. Negative meaning removal of something. And now in the future after drinking, you're less likely to drive. So the behavior is less likely. That's what makes it punishment. It's only punishment if it works. So obviously if losing your license doesn't stop the drunk driving behavior, it's not actually punishment, regardless of what the law intended. But that's what makes, negative punishment here. Another example of negative punishment might be like a parent setting up a contingency, like if you use a swear word, you don't get your allowance this week. So we'd call that negative because when they do the swearing behavior, that leads to the removal of something, the taking away of the allowance, right? Removing their money. And it's punishment if it actually works. If it actually makes the kids swear less often in the future, then that would be negative punishment. So let's test our understanding real quick. The situation in this scenario will be a dad shopping with his kid in the grocery store. And the kid's behavior is she starts yelling. Now, what happens? Maybe the dad says, I'm going to institute a contingency. When the kid's being a little punk and yelling, I'm going to remove the kid's candy from the shopping cart. So the kid doesn't get the treat that they would normally get. So if they yell, the treat is removed. And sure enough, the kid stops yelling. And since the dad always does this, if he does this consistently, the kid doesn't yell in the grocery store in the future. Yay, it worked. So what would we call this? Pause for a moment and just try to answer what it would be if you're not sure. So this would be negative punishment. Notice the color coding I've used here. It's punishment because the kid actually did stop yelling in the future. The behavior actually changed and went down. And it's negative because every time the kid does the behavior, there's a removal of something. Something is taken away. The stimulus changes by actually removing a stimulus. That's what makes it negative. Now, what about this scenario? Same basic setup. Dad's shopping with the kid who starts yelling, and every time the kid yells, the dad removes the kid's candy. So he's set up the same contingency here, the same kind of like this is what he's going to do if something happens. But in this scenario, let's say that makes the kid yell more. The kid becomes more likely to throw a tantrum in the future. So which of our four labels would you apply to this situation? Pause, maybe take a moment to try and answer this. Well, here it kind of backfired. So this would actually be negative reinforcement. It's reinforcement because what happened is the behavior actually increased. The behavior became more probable in the future, even though the dad didn't intend that. And it's still negative because every time the kid does the behavior, something is removed. But notice how things can backfire. The dad intended to do negative punishment, but accidentally did negative reinforcement. Oops. So the big lesson here is that intention has nothing to do with whether it's reinforcement or punishment. If it increases the behavior, it's reinforcement, even if you wanted the behavior to decrease. And if it decreases the behavior, then it is punishment, even if you were trying to increase the behavior. So a common application we might see of this happens in elementary school all the time. A teacher tries to punish the jokes of a class clown by telling her to be quiet. But the kid keeps interrupting class with jokes. Perhaps what's going on is all that attention from the teacher was reinforcing, even if the attention was being told to shut up or stop messing around. So the teacher might have accidentally reinforced the behavior, making it more likely, even though the teacher thought telling the kid to be quiet would be a punishment. Well, in this video with a great funny example of that same principle, a trap that many dog owners fall into. So when your dog barks or howls, you might want them to stop, right? So you're going to try to punish the behavior by yelling at the dog to stop barking, yelling at the dog to shut up. But sometimes that makes the dog bark or howl more, whether it's because the dog thinks we're all barking together as a pack now. How exciting. Or whether it thinks it has to bark louder than you. Or whether it barks more because it's scared. You're making it more scared. Or whether it barks because it just loves the attention from you that it gets when it starts barking a lot. The why doesn't matter. What matters is how the behavior is actually affected by what you do when the dog barks. And often your reaction to the dog's noisy barking behavior actually reinforces the noisy behavior unintentionally. So here's a funny example of that very thing with Walter the dog. He's a little loud, so you may want to adjust your volume down just a bit. All right, we'll stop